Over the course of my career in ministry, I have been blessed and honored to take part in what I like to call the other side of the ministry coin. And usually whenever I say that sort of thing, I mean being a part of weddings and funerals. I actually consider it to be an honor when a family invites me to partake in to play some small role in those sorts of events and occasions, to be there for a family as they're grieving, or to celebrate with them as they celebrate a new marriage. There are times that, to be honest with you, in my own opinion, they're the times that I feel the most useful. I'm going to use that one for lack of a better word. What I mean by that, like I'm not, trying to say that, I'm not usually useful. I can be sometimes, if you ask my wife. But what I mean by that is that there's so much about the ministry side of things that is very intangible, and there's a lot of things about what I do and day in and day out that I'm not going to get to know the result of this side of, forever. So it's kind of nice to have those events and those pockets of time where I can look back and say, hey, I was actually of use here, and I actually did something in this particular moment. Those are the kind of things that I enjoy being a part of and participating in. But having done several weddings and funerals at this point, I've noticed that in every wedding and funeral that I've ever done, there are two things that are a constant in both. And the first one's kind of easy. The first one is that there's inevitably going to be something that goes wrong. If you've ever participated in a wedding or you've ever been to a funeral, maybe you've seen that something has gone wrong before. In the case of funerals, it oftentimes would be like maybe the minister, which for those of you keeping score at home is me, skips over an entire portion of the service or skips a song. Maybe whoever's running the sound that day, which I have done on more than one occasion, has the wrong song queued up at the wrong time. Or it could be the case like as it was in my most recent funeral I performed. I was given the wrong name of the deceased and wasn't corrected until the service was over. Felt really good that day. In the case of weddings, it could be that maybe the guest book that was purchased is now nowhere to be found. That's what happened for Mandy and I's wedding. I had to make a Walmart run literally 5 minutes before the service got started, or something like that. Felt like 5 minutes. But she's not even paying attention, it's fine. It could be that maybe the best man decides he's going to try and be cute, and instead of handing the groom the actual ring, he gives him a ring pop. That happened at my best friend's wedding. I was that best man. Or it could be that maybe the minister just gets so wrapped up in the emotion of the day that he starts crying himself and then can't read his notes. That was my brother's wedding. I was that minister. I'm starting to notice a pattern in all the things that go wrong in these sorts of things. Maybe it's just me. That's a big deal. Anyway, but the second thing that is always a constant in both weddings and funerals, or at least something that's always, at least at work behind the scenes, it may not be up front, but it's definitely going on, is that there's always somebody who's making the whole day all about them. Now, you may hear that and you may think I'm talking about the family of the deceased or possibly the bride and groom themselves, but that's not who I'm talking about here. There's always somebody at these weddings and funerals who, in some way, shape, or form, they may not even have a single role to play in this whole event, but they are trying to get all of the attention on them. In the case of weddings, it could be a bridesmaid who's lamenting the fact that, once again, she is a bridesmaid and not a bride. More often than not, at least I found in my case, it's one or the other, the groom or the bride's mother, who just has to complain about every minute detail. It's not up to her standards and satisfactions, and she doesn't appreciate the minister's sarcasm whenever he's trying to get her to be quiet so I can do my job. Some cases, it's actually one of those guests who just doesn't see anything wrong with wearing a white dress to a wedding. That's always fun. In the case of funerals, though, sometimes it's a little bit more obvious, I think. In funerals, it could be the family dispute is revisited at the most inappropriate time and place. It could be that a distant cousin who hasn't talked to the deceased in years, possibly even decades, decides that they want to share at the time that we're giving testimonies about the person's life, and they go on, and when you really reflect on what they had to say, it was really all about them and had nothing to do with the deceased. Or, inevitably, there's always somebody at funerals who just want to see what's coming to them. But these are people who take events that are very much not about them and try to make them all about them. They're the kid who at birthday parties had to open a present themselves because they'd feel left out or they'd throw a big giant hissy fit. They're the ones who never really learned what it meant to let other people have their moment because that moment doesn't involve them. And frankly, that's just too hard for them to do. They want everything to revolve around them and every eye to be on them. They want to go out of their way to get their way and their way only. They want to do what's best for them, regardless as to what's best for those around them. They want it to be all about them, even when the situation does not call for that. Now, we may chuckle at these notions. We might shake our head disapprovingly even. But really, if we're honest with ourselves, aren't we all just a little bit like that? Now, we may not be as demonstrative. We may not be the one who's clamoring for the spotlight in that particular moment, but I think all of us, we want things to go our way. I mean, I'll throw my hand up right now and say, I really prefer it when it seems like everything around me is catering just to me. I really like going to places where people are just focused on me, where the waitress is just all about taking care of me, and the manager comes up and asks, how's everything going for you? I like things to revolve around me. I just do. And I think that all of us, on some level, we have that way about ourselves. We want things to be so focused on us. We want to be the center of everybody's attention. We want things to be catered to us. And everything in our culture and in our context, it seems to go out of its way not to discourage that, but actually to encourage that. Everything about our lives seems to be fueling the fire of our own selfishness. Have it your way. If you don't like something, just send it back. It's fine. The customer is always right. Look out for number one. These are all situations that feed the fire of our own selfishness. And here's the thing. We do not need to be told how to be selfish. It's kind of ingrained in our very nature of who we are as people. We struggle with selfishness from the time that we first utter the word mine until they put us in a box. It is constantly an issue that we are going to wrestle with our entire lives of being selfish. And for those of us who are followers of Jesus, it kind of creates a unique struggle. Because we understand here in the church that it's never supposed to be all about us, that we are supposed to not be, or we're not supposed to be selfish people, but instead we're called to be selfless, to be in service to those around us, to put away our own desires and be mindful of the desires of others, to consider others as more important than ourselves. We know it's the responsibility of the church to look out for the needs of other people. But it's so difficult when literally everywhere else around us tells us to make it all about us, to take care of ourselves above everybody else. It's so difficult for us. It creates this amazing tension within our hearts as we try to navigate what it means to serve others instead of putting ourselves first in the church. And I would love nothing more than to stand here right now and tell you that selfishness has never been an issue in the church ever. But you know, and I know, that would be a lie. If anything, selfishness almost seems to be highlighted within the church. We have this argument that selfishness is not a problem within the church, it is the problem of the church. Almost every dispute, every disagreement, every church split, everything that has ever gone on, if we boiled it down, it comes down to one person or a small group of people wanting things to go their way. That they couldn't consider thinking about the other person's perspective or thinking about another way of looking at things or thinking about things. Instead, they wanted the church to cater to them because everywhere else around us does that. So why wouldn't the church do that for us as well? The issue of selfishness runs so deep within the church that it has created all kinds of problems and tensions, and has caused more harm than anything else when we as the church tend to be selfish individuals instead of seeking out what's best for the body of believers. Oftentimes the result is nothing but pain. We have nothing but issues whenever the church is so focused on itself. And honestly, what makes the issue of selfishness so dangerous nowadays is that we've gotten really, really good about masking it. We've gotten really good about pretending our selfishness is something deeper. We've even gone so far as to make our selfishness sound like a spiritual issue. If we no longer feel that the church is catering to us, well, then we just can leave because we think that the church has lost its way. If we feel more conviction than we do self-affirmation, rather than examining our own hearts, oftentimes we'll leave that church saying, I just don't feel like I'm being fed here. Whatever the situation is, if the church is no longer seeming to cater to us, we can come up with some sort of creative phrase or statement in order to sanctify our selfishness. Because at the end of the day, that's really all we're doing. There are, of course, times and occasions where it is appropriate to make a change as to where you gather together to worship, but oftentimes, more often than not, I believe, if we boil down your reason for leaving, it's because it's no longer catering to you anymore. And so that becomes difficult for us to be. Oftentimes, if we are selfish, we no longer care whether or not the church is going in the direction that Jesus calls us to be the church that ultimately God had laid out for us, to become a place where the gospel is preached and disciples are made. But here's the thing. You and I, we are not the first people to ever try to make what we want happen above what the directions of God are. You and I are not the first people who've tried to put our own desires and our own selfishness above the overall plan that God has. In fact, it's the crux of our text today. We're going to be in Matthew chapter 16. So if you got a Bible or your Bible app, open it up to Matthew chapter 16. We're going to be in verses 21 through 23. And when we look at this story, at the center of it all, as we look at this notion of selfishness above God's ultimate plan, who would be in the middle of it but our old friend and the Bible's biggest bonehead, in my opinion, Peter. Yeah, it's been a few weeks since we talked about him, so let's talk about him today, shall we? Before we get there, I want to point out something to you. Before we actually get into the crux of this text, I want to make a point to make sure that you see this. This event takes place just before, and in fact, it's only 5 verses before we get to this point, that Peter has done something incredible. If you look up at verse 16, if you're there already, if you're not, just keep turning, that's fine. In verse 16 of chapter 16, it says this. Peter tells Jesus, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Now, we've talked about this before when we talked about Peter earlier in the year, but this is the first time anybody actually vocally confirmed that they believe Jesus to be the Messiah. This is a big, big deal. See, for a long period of time before this, there had been a lot of discussion about maybe he's the Messiah, maybe he might be the one who's been chosen of God, maybe he has come here for us. This is the first occasion where somebody who is willing to be bold enough is able to say, "You are the Messiah," to confirm the identity of who Jesus ultimately is. And it's Peter who does this. And it makes sense that it would be Peter who does this because Peter has been there for everything. Everything that Jesus has done up to this point, Peter has been right there with him. Every miracle that Jesus has performed, there's Peter. Every sign and wonder that Jesus has done, here's Pete. Every sermon that Jesus has given, every illustration that he's done, every parable that he said, Peter has been there for. If anybody would have any sort of confirmation that Jesus was the Messiah, it would be Peter. So it makes sense he is the one to say, "You are the Messiah." And that's what makes our story today so interesting. Again, just 5 verses later. We see a scene that it starts off as a scene that we see in several different places throughout Scripture and throughout the Gospels. And it has to do with Jesus talking about a really upbeat and happy thing. His own death. Right? Everybody likes that whenever somebody starts talking about their own death. That's a good time. But it starts like this in verse 21. It says, "From then on, Jesus began to point out to his disciples that it was necessary for him to go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes, be killed and be raised on the 3rd day." Now, you know exactly what Jesus is talking about. I know exactly what Jesus is talking about. Matthew, at this point in time, as he's finally putting pen to paper, he knows exactly what Jesus is talking about. But I want to remind you, the disciples have no idea what Jesus is talking about. To them, this whole thing seems a little morbid, right? I mean, their friend, their teacher, the guy who they spent all this time with, is now talking about his own death. Have you ever had that friend? Like that one particular friend who just, is just always dying? Like, no matter what ailment they've got, oh, this could be the end of it. No matter what little problem, they get a prick on their finger, all of a sudden it's been blown up to an infectious disease and they got to cut their hand off. If you've never had that friend, you might be that friend. But if you've never had that friend, it is a weird thing to be around them. It's almost taxing to be around them because it's just like, oh, here we go again. And so for the disciples, and they're hearing Jesus talking about how he's going to have to go and suffer and die and all this other stuff, this is not exactly a comfortable talk for them to have. But I want to point out three words to you that start this whole thing off. Three words that I think are important for us to keep in mind as we continue to talk about this story. And those three words are the first three words, from then on. Those three words mean something, don't they? Because this means this isn't a one-time occasion. To me, this says that Jesus has been talking a lot about this. He's been mentioning this several different times as they've been going on throughout their day and throughout their lives. Jesus has brought this subject of his death up more than once. And so for them, the disciples, they're hearing all of this coming over and over again. And finally something happens to Peter. Peter just kind of snaps. We see it in verse 22. It says that Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. "Oh no, Lord, this will never happen to you." You can kind of almost picture this whole scene taking place, right? Jesus is once again talking about his own death, and Peter's just decided, you know what, this is enough. I'm done with this. And so he pulls Jesus aside. Can I say I love that part, that he pulls Jesus aside, like he's not going to do this in front of the disciples. It's not going to be embarrassing for Jesus. Kind of wish some of us would do that sometimes. But anyway, he pulls Jesus aside and he tells him just plainly and bluntly, "What are you doing talking about this? You're making Andrew cry. Stop it. This is ridiculous. There's no way I'm going to let this happen to you, Jesus. This is not going to happen. You're talking about an event that's never going to take place as long as I can breathe air." And we get why Peter's here, don't we? Because Peter doesn't look at Jesus just as a teacher. He doesn't look at him just as some guy who's really holy and righteous. He has spent every waking moment with Jesus for years at this point. He considers Jesus to be his friend. I don't know about you. I don't like to think about my friends dying. I mean, unless their sports team is winning, and then in that case, maybe. But I don't like to think about my friends dying. I don't like that thought. Here's the fact I know is that one day they are going to. That's one of the promises and guarantees that we have in life. Death and taxes. Awesome. I know it's going to happen eventually. I don't want it to happen right now. I don't want to think about it right now. I don't want to think about it until I have to think about it. And so Peter is hearing his friend talk about his death over and over again, and Peter does not want to think about that. He doesn't want to think about the day he and his friend are going to have to say the final goodbye. He wants Jesus to be there throughout the rest of his life. He wants them to grow old in this friendship. He wants them to be together until the end. So he doesn't want to think about Jesus dying. That's what he wants. He doesn't want Jesus to talk about things that are probably never going to happen if Peter can help it. But I'm guessing, call it a hunch, Peter did not expect Jesus' response. I mean, how could you? We see it in verse 23. Jesus turned and told Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." That's going to get your attention. "You are a hindrance to me because you're not thinking about God's concerns, but of human concerns." I don't care who you are. If your friend calls you Satan, you're going to remember that conversation, right? Like that's going to stick out in your mind. And we use the phrase, "get behind Satan." I don't know. Me and my friends, we do this. I don't know if you do it or not. When one of our friends is being a little dumb, we'll just say, "Get behind me, Satan." And that's kind of our cue of, it must just be a ministry thing because like all of us are ministers, so we think it's hilarious, but clearly it's just us. And I'm okay with that. But if this is the case, like he just tells him straight up, get behind me, Satan. And we oftentimes kind of get stuck on that, so we miss the rest of the verse where Jesus tells him, you're not thinking about the overall big picture here. You're thinking about what you want. You're not considering God's plan, you're considering yours. And that's ultimately what Peter is doing here, and it's understandable that this is what Peter is doing. Jesus is his friend. He doesn't want him to die. He doesn't want to think about his friend dying. So he tells him, stop it. But that's not what God's plan is for Jesus. We know that God has ultimately called Jesus to come to this earth to be the ultimate sacrifice, to die on the cross, so that all can be saved. And in this particular verse, Peter just doesn't want to lose his friend. And we might give Peter a little bit of slack here, right? We might be willing to cut him some slack here because he doesn't know what's going to happen, right? He doesn't understand that this is what the Messiah is called to do, right? But it's here I want to remind you that just 5 verses before this whole story took place, Peter proclaimed Jesus as being the Messiah. That is a big statement to make. See, in the what we call the Old Testament, Peter would have just called it the Bible or the Torah or whatever he would have called it. In the Old Testament, there are all kinds of prophecies concerning the coming Messiah. Things like where he's going to be born and how he's going to be born and where he's going to live and how he's going to act and how he's going to function and even how he's going to die. There are prophecies that concern the cross in the Old Testament. And Peter, as a Jewish man, while he may not have been a biblical scholar, he's at least been taught this stuff. It's been shared to him in synagogues. It's been proclaimed whenever they gathered together. That he's read the text, he's heard the text, he's been around it. He's read things like Isaiah chapter 53, where it talks about the fact the Messiah is pierced for our transgressions. He's heard Psalm 22:18. He's heard Zechariah 12:10. He's read Psalm 35:11, among others. Peter has likely heard these prophecies concerning the fact that Messiah is going to have to die for the sanctification of all. But now it's different. Because the Messiah is not just a figurehead of the future. The Messiah is his best friend. Yeah, Peter's probably heard those prophecies. He's probably heard those sorts of things, but now it's a little different. Because now he can see the Messiah. Now he can hear from the Messiah. Now he can high-five the Messiah. And so this notion that Messiah is going to have to die, this is uncomfortable for Peter. This is not easy for him to swallow. But he knows this is what's going to have to happen. But in this particular moment, Peter's putting his own selfish desire above God's overall plan for salvation. Peter's not concerning himself with the things of God. He's concerning himself with the things that are best for him. He doesn't care what's going to be best for the rest of the world. He cares about what's going to be best for him. And we know that the salvation that Jesus brings, that's for every person who has been born, who will be born, who is currently being born. It's for all of us. And yet Peter's own selfish desires, had Peter have gotten his way, it would have derailed everything. It would have stopped God's overall plan for salvation. Think about that for a second. That had Peter have gotten his way right here, we would not be here. We'd still be waiting for Messiah. If Peter could have somehow stopped Jesus from going to the cross because he didn't want to lose his friend, we're still wallowing in our own sinfulness. That's a heavy thing to think about. But isn't that just like us? Again, it is so stinking easy to try and make church feel all about us. Because making things all about us is our default setting. No one has to teach us selfishness. It's part of our core as people of a broken world. I was shocked when my daughters first said the word mine, because as far as I could tell up to that point, I had never said that word around them. So I did not know where they learned it. It was just ingrained in them. Selfishness is who we are at our most basic core. The real struggle comes in being selfless and trusting that God has a better plan in store for all of us. Peter didn't really trust that what God had in store for the entire world was going to be better than Jesus sticking around for a while longer. But by putting his own selfish desires ahead of what God had in store, it had the potential to disrupt that great plan of salvation that God had. Peter's moment of selfishness could have had disastrous effects for literally every single person on earth. His selfish desires could have completely gotten in the way of God's better plan. And so it's kind of natural that we have to genuinely ask ourselves this question: how has my selfishness gotten in the way of God's bigger plan? How have those times in my life where I've been more concerned with what I want gotten in the way of God's overall plan? Because when the church caves to selfishness, there's a better than good chance we're hindering what the Holy Spirit is trying to do. We've said before, we know that our selfishness has no place within the church. We understand that. We get that. But it's like so many other things in life, it is so hard to actually put it in practice, to actually consider the needs of others above our own desires. When we pursue our own selfishness, we are hindering what God is trying to do in His church. The best way to combat selfishness, really about the only way that we can rid ourselves of it, is for us to be in service to those around us. For us to actually go and serve the world around us, to follow the example that we were given by Jesus. Paul tells us in Philippians chapter 2, verse 4, that everyone should not look to his own interests, but rather the interests of others. James goes a little even further, and he poses it to this way. In James 3, verse 17, he says, if anyone has this world's goods and sees a fellow believer in need and withholds compassion from him, how does God's love reside in him? The opposite of selfishness is service. If we want to see the church get rid of the problems that come from our own selfishness, it starts when we put a towel around our arm and look for ways to serve the people around us, to be in service to the rest of the world. We don't say here at Macedonia, love Kokomo, because it's a really cute catchphrase or it looks good on a t-shirt. We say love Kokomo because when we are making serving others our heart's desire, then we frankly have no more room for selfishness. If we are so concerned with making sure the needs of other people are being met, we don't have time left in the day to think about what I want or the ways that I think the church should cater to me. Instead, we're in service to the rest of the world. If we are able to do that, if we are able to get rid of our selfishness through service, then we're going to see the Holy Spirit do incredible things in this church. But that can't happen if we're in constant pursuit of what we want. It just can't. In order to defeat selfishness, we have to become selfless and seek to serve those around us. So much of what makes the church really what it is revolves around our need to be selfless. It's so difficult. I think it's genuinely harder for most of the American church than it is other places, because so much of our culture and our context is all about serving ourselves or being served by others. So much of our world is wrapped up in the notion of I come first. So it makes being selfless so hard. No matter how much practice we've had at it, no matter how many mission trips we've gone on or service projects we've participated in, still our default setting is going to be selfishness. It's like a cancer that we're never going to get rid of. The best we can do is just keep combating it over and over and over again. But when we look at the entire ministry of Jesus, his entire time on this planet, we see that he was constantly in service to the people around him, putting their needs above his own desires. Time after time, as you read the Gospels, you will never find a moment where Jesus just said, I need a self-care day. I need a time to just kind of detach. I need to rewatch The Office. There's never that case in Scripture where Jesus says, I'm going to take a little me time. In fact, there are several occasions where Jesus wanted to go and spend some time in prayer and just spend a little time in solitude, but the crowds followed him. And when he saw them, he didn't say, get out of here. Instead, he stopped and served them, putting their needs above his desires. As his followers, how could we possibly do any less? At the end of the day, the most definitive definition of what church really is, and if you've looked at all the ways that we've defined church throughout the course of this series, you'll see this, that church is for you, but it's not about you. Church is for you, but it's not about you. It's not about me. It's not about anybody in this room. Church is all about Jesus and his mission and his plan and his vision for who we are called to be. Jesus put it this way in Matthew chapter 20, verses 26 through 28, and we're going to close with it. He said, it must not be like that among you. On the contrary, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. Whoever wants to be the first among you must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many.